Hello, I'm Jonah. You already know this story. You've seen it in Star Wars, in The Matrix, in every other movie you've ever loved. It's called The Hero's Journey. And it's also the exact map of your own awakening, the one you're already living right now, whether you've noticed it or not. And in this video, you'll see exactly where you are on it. All of us are familiar with it on some level. Having seen plenty of things like Star Wars growing up, and it's like we're all sort of infused with the sort of basic framework of this of the hero's journey, whether we realize it or not. In fact, that was one of Joseph Campbell's points, was that in every culture across the world, we have these archetypal myths that crop up. And I remember being stunned that the hero's journey mapped so perfectly to the spiritual journey. It always begins with something very ordinary, scenes from home, where whoever's involved, you, me, the eventual Luke Skywalker, the eventual hero of the story, it begins at home, where we're identified with our personality, our roles, our beliefs, our conditionings, the way we grew up, the world that we're in, and that this is generally who we think we are. And then there comes this something disrupts our life. There's in the parlance of the hero's journey, it's the call to adventure is what it's called. And this is where something disrupts that status quo, whether it's suffering or loss. It could be wonder or beauty, or just a deep longing that appears. And there is the sense inside that there must be something more. There must be something beyond, outside the bounds of this this existence that we've begun with. And then in response to that is usually what's known as the refusal to the call. And it's simply where some kind of fear arises and the ego wants something familiar. It doesn't want it shies away from the call. Even if doing so is painful. And it was impossible not to recognize these stages in my own life. The reason I love the hero's journey is because when most people hear that phrase, it seems like a part of their mind says, well, that's the journey that heroes go on. And those are very, very special people. Those are those are people with special gifts and special abilities and special calling. They're special. That's why they're heroes. And yet that's what was so surprising to me is as I went through these things, discovering that they applied to absolutely every single human being, including myself, because I could so relate to feeling as though there was some kind of deep longing, that there were things that were disrupting my life. There was suffering, loss, wonder, beauty, and a tremendous sense that there must be something more. And that there was also a refusal to that, that there all kinds of fear would arise. Somewhere along the hero's journey comes, it's often depicted as a teacher. In the parlance of the things, it's often called meeting the mentor. And in the storybooks, it's almost always a wise person, probably one of a certain elderliness, great wisdom, great experience, because that's what makes good character-driven dramas. In in real life, that mentor isn't necessarily even a person. It could be a teacher, but it can easily be a tradition or a powerful text that someone loves, or just some profound experience that points us beyond that comfortable place that we'd been. And regardless of what form that teacher takes, whether it really is an actual person or some other form of wisdom from some other source, ultimately that role of the mentor is it helps us discover the guidance that we receive within. It brings us to the inner teacher, the inner guidance, the inner source. And then at some point in the story, we actually make a choice. We commit to something, even if it's small. And I think for most people along the hero's journey, which is all of us, the human journey, it's just some point where we decide something has to change. And so we begin doing something slightly different. And in the course of the spiritual journey, it might be beginning a course of meditation or prayer or contemplation or service to others or some other practice that we could call spiritual, but we wouldn't even have to if we didn't feel like it. It doesn't have to be specifically dressed in spiritual clothing or come from a priest or come from some spiritual tradition even. I know in my own case, for instance, one of the ways that came was waking up in the morning as a very type A personality for most of my young adulthood and finding myself inclined to sit quietly in a way that I couldn't understand, couldn't explain to others, and wasn't even sure it was even worth it myself. I just felt compelled to do it. And there was another phase during that where I remember simply thinking about what it meant to be kind and gentle and thinking that feels right. And it wasn't because of, because I was brought up by Buddhist monks. I wasn't. It was really something very, very small. And I remember walking out into the world on a very regular, ordinary kinds of days going, I think I'm just going to try to remember to even more than usual. Let me see what it's like to just remember what it means to be gentle to the world. And also, I'll be better about recycling. That seems like a nice thing to do. But in all kinds of ways, whether they were really in overtly spiritual trapping or not, we there comes a point in that journey where we make some choices, we make some commitments, and then we encounter the real trials and the ordeals. And because as we make those choices, as we make those commitments, as we bend in this direction in which we are quite certain that there's something more, we come up against our attachments, fears, desires. We come up against the deeply the things held so deeply in the canyons of our mind that may have been connected to all kinds of trauma and fears. We probably don't recognize it at the time, but they end up becoming opportunities for a kind of purification that as we face them, as we come up against them, we discover that there is some kind of opportunity for release, for letting go, for forgiveness, for some kind of purification. That's what the word purification means. It's when we take this thing that's been eating at us like acid and we have an opportunity in some way. We may not even understand it at the time, but when we begin to let them go in some way, forgive them, look past them, we discover that that acid doesn't eat at us quite so much. A word like purification sounds a little dramatic, and it sounds like the sort of thing that someone wearing robes with special insignias on it might be required to confer upon you. But in fact, it's simply the act of something within ourselves let go so that the acid is no longer eating at us. Sometimes it comes helpfully from outside. It's ultimately an inside game now. And there we are. There are the trials and the ordeals. Those are the dragons that we fight. That's Darth Vader. It makes a great story if you put it into a myth, but it doesn't change the fact that every single one of us as humans goes through the same thing. And then that inevitably leads it to the penultimate moment in the story where there is some kind of epic abyss to be crossed. There is it's the heart of the journey. Something has to be killed often. This is where the dragon is slayed. And I hesitate to put it even in those kinds of terms, except that's how most myths do so. We meet the monster. And in the spiritual journey, it's where that false self, that egoic certainty, we could say that illusion of separation begins to fall away. Even in some of the spiritual traditions, especially the ones in the East, it's where they might say the small self has to die. There's this other phrase that often crops up in Buddhism that says, this is the part where you die before you die, meaning there's some aspect of that ego that is seen as false, and so it's let go. And when it's let go, it feels like there's a part of oneself that is being let go. Except once it's let go, it's immediately recognized and realized that it was false to begin with. It wasn't really you. And so it turns out not to have been an actual loss. It turns out to be a tremendous freedom. And in spirit the traditions, we might call it surrender. We might call it ego death. Or if we're being a wee bit more rainbows and unicorns about it, we might call it awakening. That's part of discovering that that peace that underlies it was never actually absent. And there's something in there that speaks of our true nature and that presence and something unconditional, that what didn't depend on all these things swirling above it. In the mythos of the story, in the hero story, it's the treasure. It's the treasure that was guarded by the dragon. In those stories, it appears to be something gained, but in truth, it's something that is simply recognized. Once all that noise up above it has been released, even for just a moment, it's recognized that that treasure was always there. It was never absent. And so it's so riddled with something peaceful. It can be seen that it was, in fact, unconditionally present. It didn't matter what the conditions of all these things swirling around were. In the end, that treasure is unconditional. And usually the hero gets to sit and revel in that for at least a split second. But then they have to leave the cave where the dragon was and they return. They come back out. They head back down the hill. They come back into ordinary life. They still have work to do. Well, if you're in a story like that, there's probably a maiden waiting or something of that sort, or a prince. But whatever is the case, whoever it may be, there's work to be done. There's regular life. There are relationships to be contended with and to serve with what you might describe as a different center of identity. And they end up the master of both worlds. They they recognize what it means to live very fully in that relative world of everyday life, but also in the deeper reality of spirit. And so action and life continue, but it tends to flow more from a kind of freedom than from fear. Certainly, the one who set out on the journey is not the one who returns, and it's far more than simply an adventure story. Certainly, couldn't possibly be one among us that isn't familiar with having heard a call, encountered trials, learned some things, let go of some extraordinary things, and tried to figure out how to bring that right back down into regular life. And in fact, sometimes discover confoundingly that regular life is still continuing. One of the funny traps that the spiritual journeyer seems to get stuck on, that the hero's journey rarely mentions, is that we don't want to come back down the hill. There's sometimes a belief that if I reach the heights of the spiritual journey, then I get to permanently transcend my humanity. there's an incredible corollary in the East. It comes from the Zen tradition, and it's known as the Ten Oxherding Pictures. It comes from a Tang dynasty. It, Buddhism, as Buddhism started with the guy in northern India. We could call it southern Nepal if we wanted to. Over the centuries, as Buddhism became Buddhism, it made its way into China, and that's where it actually flowered. It never took root very much in India, but by the time you get to ninth century China, it's huge. And about that period of time, some of the beautiful precepts of it were sort of codified into this beautiful journey. It's like the Chinese Zen version of the hero's journey long before Joseph Campbell ever coined those terms. And artists and poets for the last 1,000 years have been redoing their version of the Ten Oxherding Pictures. And it details almost exactly everything that's just been covered, actually, usually with a simple ink drawing, a little piece of poetry, and then for the rest of us, a translation and explanation of what the poetry said. And in the ox herding pictures, hearing a call is discovering the tracks of the ox in the mud and thinking, wait a minute, where does this go? I must follow it. People often have mistaken that the ox herding pictures have 9 images because the ninth one is the spiritual traveler on top of the mountaintop receiving a kind of enlightenment. And it's often misunderstood as where that journey ends. And they forget that there's actually a 10th picture. And the 10th one is that same spiritual traveler coming down from the coming down from the mountaintop into the busy marketplace in town and having to contend with regular life. And as the Zen saying goes, to have to chop wood, carry water, and pay the bills. I might have paraphrased that last part. One of Joseph Campbell's most famous observations is the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. In the myth making, it's often an actual cave. Spiritually, we could say very accurately that that cave is essentially our own mind. And that treasure is a kind of realization that what we've been seeking has been our own deepest nature. But there are so many layers of mind that often seem to get in the way of that recognition. And it is, in fact, a recognition. It's not something brand new. It's been with us always. It's just like we sort of have to clear away the layers that have piled on top of it over the course of many things to discover what's always been there. There is not a human alive that isn't on the spiritual journey, even though they may not identify it that way themselves, and on the hero's journey. I'd say it's one of the many ways in which we really all far more alike than we are different. I think a great deal of the human journey is hearing the call and debating it, struggling with it, listening a little bit, and then forgetting, opting to say no, 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 and then it comes back around, and we go through this process of we hear a little something, we listen a little bit, and my goodness, to get to the point where we actually do something about it or really head in a particular direction over it, in the myths and the stories, that's probably 5 minutes of plot point. In our lives, it could easily be 30 years. One thing that's true about the hero's journey is it tends to follow a very handy, arc. In the movies, it's pretty predictable. In our lives, my goodness, we hem and haw and come and go and start and stop. But my God, there's no way that we ever actually get off track. We're still on the hero's journey, whether we like it or not. And that call sure comes back, even once it's been buried for a while. The timing rarely ever so cleanly linear as it is when we go to the movies. Another thing that is often said about things like screenwriting, not only do they want an arc for the entire story, a hero's journey arc for the 2 hour movie, but they also want kind of a hero's journey arc for every individual scene. And I think it's another way in which it really relates to regular life. Like we hear that call momentarily, but we refuse it. But there's some small dragons along the way that get slayed in the course of getting to the big ones. There's a million small battles along the way. There's a million small awakenings. There's the call to that adventure. It happens over and over and over. And so does frequently our refusals to listen to it. We meet that mentor, that the special teacher that shows up in the movie, again, whether it's actually an actual person or a favorite text or some tradition that we begin to hew to, or we meet teachers over and over and over throughout our lives. How many times do we make some commitment to make a change and then not quite, and then we have to commit again? How many times do trials and ordeals show up? The beautiful, clean arc of the cinematic hero's journey is a beautiful model, but it seems to be something that we replay in our lives over and over and over. And there may be a large arc to it in a way, but there's also that same kind of arc 1,000 times in a row. And it's one of the reasons I do find it a beautiful metaphor. One of the ways sometimes I put it to use in the course of my own daily life is when I look at other people and I remember for a hot second that they are in the midst of their own hero's journey, which means they're in the midst of their own call to adventure. They're in the midst of responding in some way to their own deep longing, but that they're also in the midst of those trials and tribulations of refusing that call themselves, of contending with their own fear patterns. It's really just a very elaborate way of remembering what Socrates is attributed to have said, that be kind because everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Sometimes that's been a helpful reminder to me. And not only are you in the midst of your own hero's journey, absolutely every soul that you come across is as well. It also means that every single soul you come across has that treasure within them. They may be far from discovering it, they may be near to discovering it, but it doesn't mean that it isn't in there somewhere, somehow.
I like that last line you said about what was it, Socrates? You said
Hmm.
it. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Or
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the essence of it. It's attributed to Socrates. Um,
yeah,
it may or may not have exactly been said by him, but it's very frequently attributed to him, and it does seem to have some basis in having been something that he either said or would certainly have supported.
it helps me to drop the judgment and remember love. You know,
Yeah, yeah, I
it's
do.
a
Yeah.
very helpful line. Very helpful line. Whether it was Socrates or some 17th century,
Yeah,
whatever.
that was a long time ago. But if you dig into what was happening in for him in his own work and in some of the work around him by his contemporaries, there is a startlingly non-dual thread that runs through much of it. And Socrates is the one that is a little Christ-like, actually, in that he was essentially wrongfully accused towards the end of his life. He was actually an old man by the time this came to pass, but he had been teaching, and the local authorities in Athens, they had just gotten upset about the teaching he was doing, and that it was, frankly, rousing the young people in ways that they found troubling, in a way that was really very much a corollary to the story of Christ, is that he was teaching and some of the conservative factions around him cajoled the Romans into saying, hey, go take care of this guy. And it was in a way that was actually very, very similar. Tracking him down wasn't a problem. Everyone knew who Socrates was. They just sort of picked him up and were like, hey, knock it off. And he said, but I can't possibly knock it off. This is truth. And they said, well, we don't like it. There was sort of a sham mock trial, and he was given an opportunity to recant his teaching, but he just refused to do it. And from a non-dual perspective, if one dug dug into his work, that he'd likely come to a point in his own journey in which he had discovered that treasure and knew that no matter what happened to his body, that treasure couldn't be lost. And so they said, listen, recant your teachings or drink this poisonous hemlock. And he said, I'll drink it. It doesn't really matter. What's true is still true. In fact, I can prove it by drinking it and showing you that even the death of this body, can't supersede truth with a capital T. So it's really a remarkable story, that long predated things like the crucifixion in Palestine. Everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. And even the people that look like they're doing great, don't be surprised that behind the scenes there's more to the story. They're humans as well. They are on the hero's journey. They have had to cross thresholds, meet trials, meet the abyss. They're trying to figure out what they're doing here too, even if they look like they have it together. It would be foolish for me to, speak as if I'm some sort of academic expert on on most of this. But it would seem that in the case of Buddha, the political powers that be just didn't care. There was no perception of him as a threat at all. It is well documented that Buddha was himself grew up a prince. He was a young man that was automatically in the seat of wealth and power and had given it up to wander as an ascetic. And it's also in a very different tradition. Buddha wasn't a Buddhist. He was a Hindu. Just like, Christ wasn't a Christian, he was a Jew. And by the time Buddha came along, there's already, almost 5,000 years of some tradition that has a spectacularly non-dual core to it. Like Socrates, you might say that he understood that the fundamental truth at the core of what he is cannot be impugned or altered or disturbed by drinking hemlock. With an entirely different set of circumstances and results, Buddha came to a place where he could recognize that whatever happened in the outside three-dimensional world around him couldn't disturb his peace either. All right, everybody. As always, it's a joy and a delight to spend this time with you. Peace be with you. May you take that into the busy doings of your days so that it lives and breathes in you and radiates out from you. And look forward to seeing you again. Before you go, if Exploring Awakening speaks to you, I've put together a free ebook and meditation for you with the link below. We gather like this twice a month or so for free over Zoom, in dialogue as well as silence and real presence if you want in. And if you're ready to go deeper still, there's one-on-one meetings and a retreat coming up on the Camino in Spain. All the links are down below in the description. And if this helped you, please hit subscribe. It's how these conversations keep finding people who need them. And if you want to keep going right now, I'd suggest this video, or maybe this one. Thanks for being here. Here's Walking in Spirit. Till next time.